And the first thing we're going to talk about is arm spiral. This refers to the path or the pattern of the throwing arm. This can also be called the spiral staircase. There's a couple of ways to look at this, but basically it means we're not just taking the arm into a high cock position, we're allowing that arm path to wind up to get us dynamically through that position rather than just actively trying to pull the arm up into that high cock throwing position. So the way I look at it is I'm keeping a neutral wrist, a 90-degree bend in my elbow approximately. Everything's loose through the chain so that I can maximize the whip. And I'm allowing the momentum from my handbrake to take it loosely down, up, and around. Okay, so looking at it from the front, it's taking that winding staircase path up into that high cock position. So it looks something like this. Okay, so that's the throwing arm. Allowing the arm to wind up into position, getting you to that fully stretched, scap-loaded position. We'll get to that in a second, where at that landing position, you have a full stretch, your pecs are lengthened, your scaps are retracted, you've loosely gotten dynamically through these positions rather than tensely trying to get there yourself. So that's arm path, that's the arm spiral staircase, however you want to look at it. I call it internal torque or internal rotation tension on the glove arm. And what that means is that rather than going through your spiral and the glove arm is externally rotated, supinated at the forearm, and there's no tension being created here, there's nothing to pull against, it's keeping a internal rotation torque. So it's getting a little bit of pronation and internal rotation on the glove side, so that as you go through that spiral, now at landing position you have something to unwind with. So you get here, boom. Now I have something to pull me down and release that tension rather than getting right there. There's nothing to pull against. I've already lost that tension in the glove arm. So that doesn't mean you have to be tense necessarily. It can still be a smooth loop of energy, but it does mean creating tension at certain points in the arm path. So for me, it's thinking just a little bit of tension in the back of that shoulder. From there, it's still a very loose path. It's still arms roughly at 90 degrees, elbows at 90 degrees, and it's still that fluid staircase action. But it's just an internal rotation torque on that glove arm. So, okay, if we simplify that even further and we abbreviate the arm action into a landing position right here, you can see if I lose that tension right here, there's just nothing to pull against. The arm just kind of flops out. The second we turn right there, not only is that creating some tension that I can then unwind on the glove arm, but it's actively keeping that front shoulder closed. So if I'm able to keep internal rotation tension right there, it's actually an issue I really struggled with for about 6 or 7 years. Every time I would throw is the front side just opened up. So once I started creating the internal torque on the glove arm, that keeps your shoulder closed. I want to give credit there to Luke Haggerty, X2 Athletic Performance. He actually gave me that cue. I think that's a really helpful cue for anybody who does have that front shoulder start to leak open. So if we can get to this position at landing, now we have something to unwind us over our front side. Right here, not so much. Front side doesn't do a whole lot. Might only cost you a couple miles an hour. It's not a huge deal, but when we're trying to squeeze out every last little bit and connect that final rotation into release point, that can be a big deal. The next concept and the next arm action fundamental is scap loading. I use that term because that's the term that a lot of people will understand, but it's actually horizontal abduction. So the ability to get the elbows back behind the body, get the scaps retracted, so that as we begin to rotate the shoulders, you can apply force to the baseball over a longer arc of motion. So If we're able to get in this position right here, now I can apply force to the baseball from here all the way into release point. So we'll have a longer arc of force application into the baseball versus being right here at landing position, and then we have a very short arc of force application to the baseball. So the more that we can have that flexibility in the chest, get the scaps retracted, not only do we have a tighter axis of rotation, but we're able to apply force to the baseball over a longer range of motion. Some of the confusion about scap loading, and where I kind of ran down the wrong rabbit hole for a few years, is the common teach that you have to yank the elbows back to get into that scap loaded position. So what that means, this is commonly taught, oh, okay, high level throwers get scap loaded, great. What's taught is yank the elbows back right here. Separate the hands with the elbows. The problem here is, this is what happened to me, this is why I didn't benefit anything from it for several years, is you yank the elbows back, then the shoulders begin to rotate, and what happens is the arm never flips up behind you. So by going here, beginning to rotate, you actually create a timing issue. Not that that cue is not going to work for everybody, but for me, that was really a mistake in trying to create artificially this scap loading concept. So the arm spiral concept, the loose arm spiral, is how you pass dynamically through the scap loaded position without trying to artificially create it by shrugging and yanking your elbows back. So again, you can dynamically pass through that position right here by thinking of it more in the arm spiral, glove arm internal torque model. So we pass dynamically through there. We're still in that same position at landing that we're trying to get to, but it's not forced. The next concept is the concept of tension in the arm action. This is something where you're going to want to be as tension-free as possible, with the caveat that you want to be able to still retain the mechanical guardrails, the repeatability of that arm action. In other words, you take the extreme where there's zero tension in the delivery, and now you just have a floppy arm that's very hard to repeat. You do need a certain amount of tension, a base level of tension, to actually repeat that pattern. That's the guardrails. So your arm doesn't vary so much throw to throw. You're never going to have a perfectly repeatable arm action, but having these guardrails, having a certain amount of tension, and knowing where to hold that tension is important for being able to repeat that arm action every time, versus being too loose, and then you start to lose that repeatability. So where I have tension, there's a very slight amount of tension in the bicep just to maintain that 90-degree angle. So as little tension as I need to maintain that angle, and as little tension through my scaps to be able to retain the actual path. But a lot of it is just capturing the momentum from handbrake. It's using gravity to my advantage and keeping that 90-degree angle. So if I just let this arm fall, it wants to already go through this pendulum motion. And from there, it's just a little bit of scap retraction to be able to allow that to just capture the momentum and circle up into that high cock position and actually flip up. So we're capturing momentum with that pendulum action and using a little bit of scap retraction to actually get the arm to flip up. Besides that, it's not actively yanking up the arm, it's no upper trap activation, and it's not actively yanking the elbows back. So what exactly do I mean by mechanical guardrails? Guardrails is kind of a term I came up with that represents how to repeat your arm action. In other words, knowing where you're supposed to be creating and applying tension throughout the full arm action. That's what's going to allow you to repeat that same path. So if we're able to keep tension in the same places, your arm is going to be able to follow in the same path on a more consistent basis, throw to throw. So having internal torque tension, having the same amount of tension in terms of keeping my elbow at 90 degrees, creating these guardrails allows me to have a more consistent release point from throw to throw. this is something that's gonna come for a lot of guys naturally just from getting more and more repetitions. But initially, as you're learning a new arm path, being aware and cognizant of where you're holding that tension is important for being able to repeat throw to throw until that becomes an ingrained motor pattern. The next concept, which is an extremely important concept, is syncing both arms into the plane of shoulder rotation. What that means, if the shoulders are rotating this way, it's allowing both arms to sink into that plane of rotation so that we can maximize the amount of energy that's actually transferred into the ball. An example of that not happening is shoulders rotating this way on this plane and arm moving this way. So that would be an example of shoulders in this plane, throwing arm in this plane, and there's actually very little transfer of that rotational energy. So a lot of times when you're seeing that, you'll see guys forward flexing through their trunk rather than rotating everything together. An example of that done properly, and I can show you in an abbreviated sense, is we get right here, and now you see both elbows are in line, in a straight line, and now we're gonna rotate that together. So this is everything rotating in the plane of shoulder rotation, and this is an example of you not effectively getting the arms into that plane of rotation. Another way to picture this concept is to take a PVC pipe, broomstick, whatever, put it on your shoulders, and understand that everything needs to rotate in that same plane. So this all stays in line, and as we rotate, it all happens together. So this is kind of a feel drill for understanding what that means as far as syncing everything in the same plane of rotation. So this is what it would look like. Take that away, and it's the same thing right here. Everything syncs up in that tight plane of rotation to maximize energy transfer to the ball. In order to sync your arm action up into the whole delivery, the timing and the sequencing of this is the most important thing. What this means is not hijacking your delivery with an early arm action as opposed to letting the lower half do the work first. So as soon as you break your arm, as soon as you break your hands and start moving down the mound, the first thing you do is try to get arm action dominant. That hijacks the kinetic chain, the flow of energy from the ground up and from back to front. So it's understanding that the arm action comes in loose and late, letting the back leg, the lower half, do the work first, and then bringing the arm in as late as possible. It doesn't mean to have a late arm at landing, but it also doesn't mean to start the delivery with an arm action dominant delivery. There's a few guys that can get away with that. Aaron Sanchez is one example of kind of an arm action dominant pitcher who doesn't really let the back leg fully do its job before bringing the arm action into play. But it's very hard to maximize your genetic limit, your genetic velocity limit, if you don't allow the lower half to do its job and squeeze everything out of the lower half first, everything out of the hips first, and then bring in the upper half. As far as working on your arm action, it's no secret to guys that follow me that I love plyo care drills to be able to work on this in kind of a controlled, isolated setting where you don't have to worry about hitting the target, where you can experiment with ball weight and weight variation to work on remapping your arm action. So I really like the plyo care drills and iterations of those to work on remapping your arm action. So as far as ball weight recommendations, the heavier balls are going to give you a little bit more immediate feedback when you're throwing. What that means is a 2-pound ball, and this is the heaviest I would go when working on these drills at lower efforts, is as you're going through the movement, it's an exaggerated ball weight. What that means is that you can really feel that momentum that you're trying to capture from gravity. You can really feel the ball laying your arm back. You can really feel the path that the ball takes you through. So there's a lot more immediate feedback when you're first learning a skill. If you're having trouble getting the arm to sink into the plane of rotation, then you might try an abbreviated arm action to work on that. Okay, you might try the feel of getting the elbow up into that plane and working it that way. That's not something that I would do max effort with the green ball. But again, it's a great way to learn the feel of the drill, to learn the path of the arm, and then you can work into higher velocity throws with lighter balls as you start to get comfortable with that feel. So I want to touch on two final cues that kind of encapsulate how I simplify all this stuff that I've thrown at you into how I view my arm action. And the first one is something I realized about a year ago when thinking about the shape that my arm path took. And it's looking at it as a figure 8 or infinity sign, a horizontal 8. So it's looking at it as this pattern in terms of not looking at the glove arm and the throwing arm as two separate entities, not looking at it as a 1 and then 2-piece arm action, but rather being able to understand the interrelation between the two. In terms of your brain looking at it as one loop of energy rather than two isolated paths. So a good example, Aroldis Chapman, we'll put him up in the video here. Looking at him in slow motion, you can see that the glove arm and the throwing arm work together. And this doesn't mean that it's an exact mirrored image of each other. It doesn't mean it's equal and opposite, but it does mean there's a unified loop of energy as he's going through that capturing of momentum and syncing everything in the same plane of rotation. So he's capturing that energy and feeling how that loop of energy opens and then closes. So you can think about it, open the loop of energy, first part of the figure 8, right here. Now we're closing that loop of energy right there. So figure 8 is a good way to look at it, as if you're having trouble syncing up the glove arm with the throwing arm and it starts to confuse you and you have way too much going on where you're thinking about 1, 2, it's just not a unified pattern. That's a good way to cue guys into thinking of it as one unified loop of energy. And then the final cue is something that shockingly can oftentimes take care of an arm path by itself and immediately. It's something that seems to click with a lot of guys, and that is looking at it as a tennis serve. What I mean by that is, imagine if you just served a tennis ball. It's right up here, right at where your release point would be. Wherever your release point is, it's standing right there. Now you're forced with tennis racket to start with your hands together. How do you get to hitting that ball as hard as you can on a downhill angle? Well, a lot of guys would immediately say, okay, ball's right there, got my tennis racket, hit it like that. It starts to sink in when you think about it as a tennis racket, because that 90-degree angle kind of takes care of itself. The getting of your front side kind of takes care of itself. The hitting downhill kind of takes care of itself. So you don't necessarily have to get a tennis racket and do this, but that's one way of thinking about it that seems to really help guys visualize it in their head. Same thing with pull downs. You say, there's a ball floating right here. We need to run, hands together, and hit that as hard as we can. What you typically see is guys tend to understand that. It sinks in their mind, and they're able to feel the loose tension and the looseness, the tension at the elbow to keep a 90-degree angle and still getting over their front side. So tennis racket cue and the figure 8 cue or infinity sign cue are two ways of visualizing everything that I've just thrown at you so that your brain interprets it as one movement pattern rather than 100 different things going on.